Good morning, everybody. This is Kristin Maharg with the Colorado Foundation for Water Education, and I'd like to welcome you to What's New in Colorado's Water Plan webinar. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have nearly 100 people registered, and about 30 or 40 of those have joined so far, so we'll just kind of get going a little slowly here, let folks trickle in this morning. A couple housekeeping items that I'd like to cover for you. If this is your first time joining a webinar, you are viewing my screen right now on my computer, so you can see the PowerPoint presentation that we have pulled up here. I have disabled the audio for everybody, and so if you have a question, instead of unmuting you, we'll ask you to type your question in the question box on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Those questions will be sent to the presenters and myself. So if you have a technical question, something isn't working right with your system, you can go ahead and send your question to us. If you have a clarifying question as we go through the presentations, you're more than welcome to send those quick questions to us as well. But then we also will have a moderated Q&A session at the end of the presentations. And so we've also received lots of questions ahead of time for those of you that have filled out your questionnaire. So we thank you for providing that input to the presenters ahead of time. So we've captured those questions, and then we'll give you an opportunity at the end of the hour to ask questions, and we'll try to wrap things up by 10:30 at the latest. I'd also like to let you know that we are recording this webinar today, and so we will post the recording on the CWCB website as soon as possible and let you know when that's up, so that you can share it with your members and constituents across the state. And that is all we have for housekeeping items. Like I said, if you do have a question, feel free to ask us. I'd like to just go over the goals of this webinar. So many of you, in looking at the questionnaire and looking at the registrant list, many of you have been intimately involved with the Basin Roundtable process, IBCC, and Colorado's Water Plan over the past year to 10 years. And so we designed this webinar specifically for those who have been involved, who have some knowledge of the first draft of Colorado's Water Plan. And this webinar is intended to go over what is new in the second draft that was released just about 10 days ago. And so many of you probably haven't read that second draft in detail, which is completely fine. That's the purpose of today, is to go over some of those highlights for you. And also let you know what CWCB has in store over the next couple of months. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters. For the first 15 minutes, we will hear from Becky Mitchell, who is the section chief at the Water Supply Planning section at the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And then we'll have a more in-depth presentation from Jacob Bornstein with the Colorado Water Conservation Board as well, who will go in much more technical detail on certain chapters of the plan. And then we also have Kate McIntire with us as well, who will go over the input that was received in the drafting of the first draft, as well as plans for public engagement moving forward. So I'd like to turn it over to Becky Mitchell, and let's welcome here this morning. Hi, Becky.
Hi, Kristin. Thanks so much. I'm Becky Mitchell, again, the Chief of Water Supply Planning section at the CWCB. As many of you all know, the CWCB represents each major water basin, Denver, and other state agencies in our joint effort to use water wisely and protect our water for future generations. Joining me here, as Kristin said, is Jacob Bornstein, the Interbasin Compact Committee and Basin Roundtable Program Manager, and Kate McIntire, who runs the outreach, education, and public engagement efforts related to the plan and other aspects throughout the Water Conservation Board. They're going to help me present some items and be available for additional questions. Moving on to the next slide. So today we're going to dive into the second draft of Colorado's water plan, as Kristin said. However, we know there are some people participating today that may not know as much as some of the other folks. So we'll provide a little bit of a backup for those people, but also suggest that you all read through the fact sheet that we sent out in the pre-webinar materials, as well as visit the website for general information and, of course, to read the actual plan itself. In addition to some brief background, today we're going to go over the following. The Critical Action Plan, which is actually Chapter 10, Efficient and Effective Permitting, which is Section 9.4, some more detail on environmental resiliency, M&I conservation, reuse, and land use, some more detail on funding, and update on the status of the Conceptual Framework, which is part of Chapter 8, the strategy for updating Colorado's water plan, which is Chapter 11. We'll go over some other changes in the second draft of Colorado's water plan, and then, as always, we're going to push on how the public can stay involved as the plan is finalized and implementation begins. So here's some of the background on the stakeholder-driven water planning process that's going on in Colorado. Developing Colorado's water plan is proving that open source policy and planning development works. As I talk today, we've already heard from over 24,000 people on what should be included in the plan. But before I go over that, I'll tell you a little bit about why we need a water plan. We all know the challenges that Colorado faces. We have sustained and systemic drought, the worst 14-year period of snowpack we've ever recorded, catastrophic 100-year floods, downstream states in the midst of a 500-year drought, a warming climate, significant infrastructure, permitting, and financing challenges, engineering challenges where most of the population is on the Front Range and most of the water is on the West Slope, a rapidly increasing population accompanied by unacceptable amounts of agricultural buy and dry. We need a strategy to face these challenges head on. While the actual draft of Colorado's water plan has officially been under development for the last year and a half or so, I think you could safely say that the framework for the plan has been percolating since 2003 with the first SWASI, or Statewide Water Supply Initiative, or you could go back even earlier to 1976 when Chip Berry and Bill McDonald began preparing the Colorado Water Study, which was the start of a state water plan. But at the time, the effort lacked political support. All that is to say that Colorado's water plan aggregates and builds upon a strong foundation of knowledge, existing studies, and collaborative processes. Fundamental to this work has been the Interbasin Compact Committee, created in 2005 by House Bill 1177. The IBCC, or the Interbasin Compact Committee, is a 27-member committee, including 2 members from each of the 9 basin roundtables, also established in the Act. The roundtables and the IBCC provide a forum for our locally driven collaborative solutions for interbasin and statewide issues. The work of the IBCC and the roundtables has been the foundation of the water plan through basin-specific implementation plans, or what we're now endearingly calling BIPs. So as I mentioned before, the official draft of the plan started approximately 2 years ago, or 2 years? 2 years ago, May 14th, 2013, when Governor Hickenlooper issued an executive order calling for Colorado's water plan. The executive order identifies 3 overarching values that the plan should reflect: a productive economy that supports cities, agriculture, recreation, and tourism, efficient and effective water infrastructure, and a strong natural environment, including healthy watersheds, rivers, streams, and wildlife. It was also directed through this executive order that the CWCB develop a plan that reflects these values, utilizes the expertise of the Basin Roundtables already in existence, aligns projects, studies, and funding, and allows for more efficient project permitting. So, yeah, Rodney Dangerfield And how can we all relate to them? So this goes back to our board meeting last week, where one of our board members endearingly said that the public was like Rodney Dangerfield. We don't get no respect. But I reflected on that, and I tried to find out some information on Rodney Dangerfield. I wouldn't suggest doing an internet search because most of it's inappropriate. At least wait till you get home to do that. But really what I wanted to focus on is that the point is Colorado is facing an era of competing needs, and everybody feels like they could quote Dangerfield. We don't get no respect. If we view things from our own singular perspective, it's easy to think we're being attacked. For example, you can read, I'm not going to read it, but you can read through the categories of each slide. If we work together, there are opportunities to find balanced solutions that support agriculture, municipalities, and the environment. If we face all of these challenges as a package in order to support Colorado's water values, this won't be easy, but this is what Colorado's water plan is working towards. So, as some of you know, because you were involved in the development, the Basin implementation plans were submitted to the CWCB this last April 2015. The second draft of Colorado's water plan was released for public review on July 7th, and the public comment deadline for the second draft of the water plan will be September 17th. All of the comments received till that point will be considered for the final water plan, which will be submitted to the governor no later than December 10th of this year. On to what everybody wants to talk about, which is the detail on Chapter 10, the action piece of the plan, the critical action plan. We turned Chapter 10, originally envisioned as a list of legislative recommendations, into a strategic action plan that summarizes all of the critical actions throughout the plan. Chapter 10 will also be used as a standalone document to guide future implementation of Colorado's water plan. Chapter 10 specifies the methods by which the actions will be achieved, such as through legislation or changes in agency policies. Within Chapter 10, we pull together the actions within the plan that have the greatest impact to support the 7 themes you can see listed on the slide. The first one is to develop a multi-purpose funding plan. The second is to promote multi-purpose initiatives. The third, to promote vibrant and sustainable cities. The fourth is to address agricultural viability and efficiency. The fifth is to support a strong environment and a robust recreation industry. The sixth is to prepare for an uncertain future. The seventh is to advance education and outreach. Those are not listed in a priority order. Those are just what we came up with, and it was arbitrarily decided which way they went in Chapter 10. So no one is less important than another. It's important to recognize that. Just because there were actions that were embedded throughout Chapter 10 or throughout the plan that weren't included in Chapter 10, it doesn't mean that those actions shouldn't be addressed. They're still on the radar for things that we're going to be doing within the state. The actions within Chapter 10 are the ones that we need to focus on and the ones that can be implemented in the near to midterm. We're expecting a lot of feedback on this chapter, and we look forward to your comments. The content that we'll cover through the rest of the presentation will highlight some of the rest of the actions in Chapter 10. Yeah. So I wanted to give you a little bit of example of just a small portion of Chapter 10. So Chapter 10 is organized not only by the 7 themes we just covered, but there's also sub-themes within each theme. So I just wanted to walk through this one, promoting additional storage and infrastructure. As you can see throughout this slide, there's a critical action. There's a goal on the top under right by E, that action E, or goal E, and then there's some critical actions beneath it that support that goal. And you can see in the table the sections that came from, and they're not just one section, there'll be multiple sections and they interrelate. And then you can see where some of the responsibility lies in terms of the partners and who needs to be tracking on if we can get these actions done. the timing is in the when column, where we can see that whether this is ongoing or continual, or this needs to be achieved in the near term. On other actions, there'll be a midterm. And what type of action it is in the final column, whether it's programmatic or reliant on funding and things like that. Thank you, Kristin. Can you go on to the next slide? Moving on to more detail on section 9.4, this is the permitting section, a very important section of the water plan. The actions that came out of section 9.4, one was to conduct a series of lean events among state and federal agencies and stakeholders in order to improve the efficiency of the permitting process by eliminating duplication and eliminating redundant review efforts. We expect that will be kicking off at some point in the near future, possibly even prior to the final plan coming out. We also felt that it was necessary as an action of this section to clarify the path to state endorsement and help project proponents recognize what they need, what criteria they need to meet to get to state endorsement. Another action that came out of this section was to indicate the need to determine a lead agency for each major category of issues related to water project permitting. There's also an action to create a permitting handbook and also ensure that state agencies actively participate as cooperating agencies from the outset of a regulatory process. This graphic represents the current process for permitting. If the state becomes a cooperating agency, it can occur after the draft EIS. 401 certification occurs after the record of decision, and the state has no leverage to move the permitting process forward if it is confident that wildlife and water quality issues are mitigated or enhanced. This can lead to lengthy and confusing processes for project proponents, and sometimes means that important studies that should have started years earlier must be foregone, thus producing poorer results for the environment and the overall project. You can click. The first change that the water plan proposes is moving state agency cooperation earlier in the process. This will allow the state to weigh in on methodologies for the EIS, ensure that the scoping issues are raised, and help to plan mitigation and enhancements. Secondly, doing this work early on could mean that state permitting agencies recommend to the governor that state endorsement be provided. In order to do this, the draft EIS must ID alternatives and detail mitigation and enhancements for water quality. The state provided this recommendation to the governor's office. Lastly, once this occurs, if the alternative does not change, that a conditional 401 certification and a wildlife mitigation plan can be moved forward between the draft EIS and the record of decision. Now I'm going to hand it over to Jacob for additional information on some of the other topics.
Great. Thank you, Becky.
Hello, everyone. Jacob Bornstein here. Thank you for joining us. The first topic that we'll cover is providing more detail on environmental resiliency. This information can be further explored in section 6.6 of the plan. As many of you know, the Interbasin Compact Committee indicated that environmental resiliency should occur with or without a new trans-mountain diversion in Colorado, and we believe that it was important in the second draft of the plan to develop more information on environmental resiliency as well as stream management plans. In addition, the CWCB identified the need for common metrics to measure the health and resiliency of these watersheds, rivers, and streams, and added an explanation to move forward with near-term projects and methods that address high-priority environmental and recreational needs. Let's first take a look at environmental resiliency. This language, for those of you who are familiar with the conceptual framework, is the way that environmental resiliency is defined as the ability for a stream or watershed to recover function after a disturbance, whether acute or chronic. To add on to that, what it's basically saying is that in order to absorb changes, the environment within that ecosystem should still exist after some type of change occurs. Resilient river systems provide complex and connected aquatic and riparian habitats and support diverse, abundant, and reproducing populations of aquatic and riparian species. To determine levels of resiliency, it is necessary to identify baseline status of these characteristics and to monitor these streams and watersheds on an ongoing basis. Planned projects and methods should incorporate the potential stressors of drought and climate change, including decreased supply and changes in runoff and timing. Let's move forward to talk about stream management plans. Stream management plans came from an abundance of public comment from many of the environmental groups, and the second draft of the water plan provides a lot more detail on what stream management plans are. As many of you know, $1 million was allocated for stream management plan in the projects bill, CWCB funding out of the watershed grant program that we have here. And guidelines were passed by the CWCB board just this past week at the July board meeting for stream management plans. And there's a description in the second draft of the water plan for how they go. It should be noted that stream management plans mean more than just stream flow. They also mean looking at the geomorphology of the stream and assessing the physical conditions of the stream reach as well as riparian conditions. The point of a stream management plan is really to ask ourselves, what projects and methods do we need to implement on the stream, understanding the complex interworkings of habitat, geomorphology, and water supply, and what's achievable to move forward in further developing those streams' needs. More detail in section 6.6. Moving on to municipal and industrial conservation, reuse, and land use. As many of you know, the second draft of the water plan incorporates what we're deeming a stretch goal for conservation, for municipal conservation, of 400,000 acre feet off of the projected 2050 water demands. However, that's just the headline, and so we wanted to take a little bit of time to go through that. So let's do that now. All right, so there's the headline in bold. But why do we need a stretch goal? Some people have asked, why just a municipal and industrial stretch goal? Why not a stretch goal on other aspects as well? First of all, this came from a lot of public comment, and it came from the Interbasin Compact Committee's, I know it sounds long, Conservation Subcommittee. And they believed that we needed a stretch goal, and the recent drought in California at just 6% and mandatory conservation restrictions that have led to about a 30% decrease in just this last year, as well as ongoing droughts that have occurred in Texas and here in Colorado. And so the thought is, especially since the governor says every conversation must begin with conservation when we're talking about water, we believe that it was important to develop a stretch goal, and so have supported the IBCC's efforts on this work. Essentially, that 400,000 acre feet is based off of the statewide water supply initiative work back in 2010, and it will likely need to be updated. But as of now, it lies exactly right in the middle between medium and high conservation levels, and it's about 60,000 acre feet of demand reduction beyond the no and low regrets recommendations that we've discussed previously in the plan. It does not say where that water should be applied. It does not say that it needs to go toward the gap. If you remember, the no and low regrets said about half of the savings should go toward the gap, but the committee believed that we should be silent on that matter as we don't know how that water will be used into the future. So what is a goal? A goal is only a goal unless it has some type of implementation associated with it. And so this again comes directly from the committee work. And after looking at the conservation plans, they believe that, and staff believes as well, that this goal could be actually achievable. And we're working on backing that up with some of the data that we're getting from all the water providers who provide 2,000 acre feet or more as part of 1051 data requirements. But there was also the need to show accountability. And so as right now we provide a requirement that all of those water entities who provide 2,000 acre-feet or more must submit conservation plans. And the thought was here to increase that to ask for and require comprehensive integrated water resource planning geared toward implementing those best practices at the higher customer participation levels, essentially to look at how those high conservation best management practices identified in SWASI could be implemented and whether or not that worked. What this does is it allows for local control to remain because some of those don't make sense for communities, are not appropriate. The cost to water savings ratio, it just doesn't work out. So it allows for that local flexibility while still asking for good planning is essentially where this went. Of course, we will need to monitor and track this over time. We're about to go into a whole nother round of SWASI. Technical work will be updated. We'll reassess all of this. And as we measure, it might need to be adapted over time to adaptive management. Next slide, please. It's gotten a little glitch. Hold on a sec. Ah, there it is. Okay. So it went one forward, but that's okay. So what this table represents are the toolbox that are potentially open to move things forward. Click one more time. 1 and 2 are really heavy-handed. Mandates for dense housing, regulations requiring conservation, and that's not part of Colorado's water plan. It is part of states like California who need to react as opposed to prepare in advance. And we in Colorado, strong local control state, believe that through more encouragement and incentives, we can find the path forward to achieving similar conservation goals. Already, we require retailers to sell efficient products. Many of you remember what was fondly called the toilet bill, which is officially the fixtures bill, which passed a couple years ago. And Colorado's water plan, the second draft, considers also adding to that list high irrigation, outdoor irrigation efficiencies to that list. Click. Already, water providers are doing conservation programs. Of course, we at the state are encouraging that and will continue to do so. But we give a little gold star because almost all of the water providers, and not just we at the state, but as a community within Colorado, almost all of the water providers providing 2,000 acre-feet or more already have conservation plans, and many water providers who don't are starting to do regional plans who provide less than 2,000 acre-feet. The water providers also do a great job talking to their communities and asking Coloradans to do conservation and efficiency. And so another gold star for the water providers there. Number 6, encourage local governments to implement water and land use practices. One of the concepts there is based off of Senate Bill 08, which was just passed this last year, which is asking the CWCB to partner with the Department of Local Affairs to conduct workshops. And so we'll be doing that in the near future. There's about $50,000 allocated to that to work with local governments to consider land use practices and conservation practices that are under their control to help move forward. We already talked about the need to require good planning. We're talking about potentially increasing that in the draft to do integrated planning. And right now, there are some opportunities to fund conservation through loan programs, and we're talking about changing that to increase the ability to do that. And lastly, under 9, we're talking about funding grants for conservation. Currently, we have $500,000 annually that we can apply toward the grant program. We're talking about increasing that, which we'll get to with the funding, up to $10 million a year. What that would do is we could apply that to a tax credit for local homeowners or something like that. Go ahead, Kristin.
There's a question that came up on the slide, Jacob, on mention of a floor put on water providers who are required to conserve according to state goals of 2,000 acre-feet. So where did this number come from? Is there a basis for this, or why not 1,000 acre-feet?
Sure. So the 2,000 acre-foot level is what we call a covered entity, and that was defined back in the 90s as, and I agree, I don't know where 2,000 came from, but essentially not wanting to overburden small communities to be required to do conservation plans, data requirements, etc. So it's carried forward, I think, from the 90s all the way forward. We do have an action in the plan that considers taking another look at the level of covered entity, and that's been discussed by the IVCC and by staff as a possibility. So we'll be taking another look at that number and seeing what makes sense for that. So great question.
Thank you.
Okay, next slide. We don't have time to go in detail on water reuse and water land use. There has been a lot of work done on water reuse in the near future. The Water Environment Research Foundation used the CWCB grant to advance this through stakeholder process, and a lot of those new recommendations are incorporated into the plan. I'll also note that the Metro South Platte Roundtable came up with some additional reuse projects and methods, and those are summarized in the plan. And we are looking toward encouraging regional reuse options and clarifying the regulatory environment, which needs some work. The water and land use section is also further expanded based off of that Senate Bill 08, which I mentioned previously, and the Colorado Water and Growth Dialogue. This is important to consider. In addition to those workshops that I mentioned, which are listed here, it also requires conservation plans to incorporate land use practices into them. Okay, moving on, or attempting to. All right, so now we're going to go into more detail on funding opportunities. So section 9.2 is based off the work of the newly created Water Investment Funding Committee. Remember, this is a draft. We expect lots of opportunities for public comment and discussion with you and others about this. But what's really obvious is that for almost every area of the plan, we need more money, whether we're talking about conservation, agricultural viability, alternative transfer methods, municipal and industrial projects, environmental and recreational projects. We need to find more money. So what I'm going to show you now discusses an opportunity about how to have the smallest amount of money have the greatest impact as we move forward. So here's the first problem. We really want to encourage multi-partner and multi-purpose projects, but right now they're discouraged. You want to have a project that groups all these communities and those little headgates that's representing agriculture. So that's an example of a multi-purpose project. However, one of the things getting in the way are that you have differing credit scores. Some communities have AA or AAA credit scores, but other communities have poor credit scores. And what these credit scores mean, and I know this sounds technical, but it basically means that many of these water providers, water users need to go it alone because it's too hard to bundle up funding to work together. And it's not just that we need one multi-purpose project. We're estimating up to $20 billion worth of raw water types of projects are needed across Colorado. One way that we can support doing these projects is by developing a repayment guarantee fund. The concept here is that if you have about 10% of a bond held by the state, that it would raise credit ratings to all be in the AA or AAA level. And what that means is that partners can work together and bundle bond funding on the private market and really be successful. So we're not talking about developing a bunch more bond authority by the state of Colorado, but rather developing a repayment guarantee fund so that the bond market rates these water users and providers at a higher level. And of course, it's not just municipal and industrial. Up to $3 billion, perhaps 10 to 15% of that $20 billion level could be needed to support the environment, protection, and recovery, as well as recreation. One way to think about how to fund large environmental and recreational projects is to develop a market for green bonds. Essentially, this allows private investors to come into Colorado, invest in large-scale environmental or recreational projects, and be paid back with small amount of dividends over time so that we can spread out the costs from the state of Colorado. And there's lots of other needs too. So whether we're looking at needs to incentivize alternative transfer methods, to implement conservation, we already discussed that potential tax credit program. We'll need to figure out how we could best use an infusion of funds, pay for upfront costs and planning, further support agricultural viability, and fund water education and outreach. These all have pretty hefty price tags, especially when you're looking over the next 30 years. These are just estimates. So how do we get money? Here's what the Water Investment Funding Committee, these are the opportunities that it considered. State bond referendum. Should sound familiar. Some of you still have PTSD from referendum A over a decade ago. This is also a really big ask. And we believe that we can get most of the bang for the buck through that guarantee repayment fund. Mill levy increases. This is a viable option to look at property taxes. However, many local water groups such as conservancy and conservation districts have the opportunity to do this, and that would take away a local option. Same with water user fees, whether you're talking about assessments on the agricultural side or additional fees associated with municipal taps. These take away local options. There's a tax associated with insurance premiums that insurance carriers provide. The original concept behind that was to provide water for fire mitigation. However, that's already being used in the general fund, and we doubt that they would be interested in diverting that. CWCB, the General Assembly decided to take $163 million from CWCB funds and provide it to the general fund during the state budget crisis. 40 million of that has already been paid back. And so one concept that was explored was perhaps we can get that 123 million back some way or another. However, that is actually not likely to be a very viable solution unless we look at severance tax. Some folks within the legislature are looking at severance tax increases for a variety of things, one of which is water. This does not create long-term funding, but could provide initial funds or funds later on. Let's get through this, and then we'll address that question. The container ballot initiative, this was a concept that was floated a few years ago. It was considered, the container ballot part was considered a single issue by the Supreme Court, and that could have long-term viability. If we decide as a state, not just the state agencies, that we need to go ask the public for additional money, then this will take everybody on the phone, all of the stakeholders to pull together and really help ensure that this is successful. Otherwise, it will not be possible. Lastly, the other idea that was floated was a water fixtures and appliances and an equipment fee. So every time you buy a washing machine, a hose, a toilet, etc., a fee would be associated with that. We put this on the potential long-term list. It hasn't been tested, so to speak, so it's a potential long-term. So it looks like we have a question. Kristin?
Yeah, so Becky, this might be a question for you. Wondering if there are any draft bills in process with the Water Resources Review Committee of the state legislature as part of their upcoming meetings?
I don't believe so at this point in time. I know there's probably some discussion that's happening, but I will be attending the Water Resource Review Committee in Craig on Wednesday, and I'll let you know what is discussed there. If there's any riveting news out, we can email the entire group that was on this call.
Good question. And we have another question here on the Bond Repayment Guarantee Fund, asking that normally when one entity assumes another entity's risk, there's strict protocols that get into financial practices and debt coverage ratios, revenue streams. Wondering if the state has had conversations about what it would expect from water providers in order to qualify for that loan guarantee program.
Yes, so you're right. CWCB's loan program often has collateral associated with loans to risky providers. We haven't had detailed discussions on who or on what the specific requirements would be, but the concept would be that there would be some type of collateral that would be needed, and some type of way to encourage good practices as we move forward with the projects. But more detail to come, and if anybody would like to or has specific thoughts about this, Becky and I and Tim Feehan, who's the section lead on this section, who's the author, the primary author of it, would be happy to sit down and talk to anybody. Any other questions about this?
Just one or two other questions here, Jacob. Someone had asked about the concept of water banking as a potential revenue source. Is that something that's considered in this chapter?
Water banking is considered, we'll talk about it in just a minute at the next chapter, but not necessarily as a potential funding source. Rather, we expect that it's probably another one of those boxes that we should add. We're funding for critical water users who cannot pay for an insurance through the water banking program, would need to have funds. So that's sort of another need for money rather than another source of money potentially.
Right. Great. So let's we'll hold the remainder of the questions until the end of the presentations, just to see if those questions are answered. So
right.
Keep them coming in, please. Thank you.
Okay. So next we have an interesting slide. Some of you have seen this before. So let's say 123 million, this is just how it could work, is received, say, from severance tax or some other source. We could split that up to support and planning funds, water supply reserve account program, alternative transfer methods, agricultural conservation and viability, education and outreach. Another 100 million would go into this guarantee fund. That could leverage up to $1 billion in projects. One way that we could get the maximum amount is that as people are paying off their loans, we don't need to hold as much of the 100 million, so that money could then go to pay green bonds. So we recycle that money as the loan is repaid, so it's multi-purpose money, and then that could pay for a $100 million investment over time. Given the timing of when those funds occur, we may need some funds to bridge the gap to pay green bonds until loans are issued and the guaranteed repayment fund starts to decrease. So we may need some additional funds. So the container fee bill or something else could then replenish these different sources and eventually grow to support billions in projects over time. When we presented this at the Interbasin Compact Committee, they said, well, where's our money for agriculture? And the concept that we've discussed internally is that existing CWCB loans and some of those new grant dollars that we're talking about in the support and planning funds would go to support agricultural viability, efficiency, and conservation. So another 100 million would go there. So essentially what this plan shows is how can we recycle, reuse, and leverage the smallest amount of dollars to have the greatest effect here in Colorado which would be the smallest ask to the public. We explored a couple other things. We already talked about expanding the loan program for conservation, but also some environmental and recreational projects can pay back over time and reuse. We discussed a tax credit for homeowners as part of the container fee. Public-private partnerships are discussed a lot in this section, and the need for regionalization and modifying legislation to allow for water public-private partnerships. Right now, the legislation is, the statutes are a little murky, and it might need to extend loan repayment periods to have smaller dollars going every year to pay back loans for those cases that need it. So that's the funding section. I'm going to move forward a little rapidly now as we're sort of falling a little bit behind schedule because we started answering some questions. So the Conceptual Framework, the Interbasin Compact Committee discussed this last Monday. 20 out of 23 members voted to support the Conceptual Framework and put it into the second draft of Colorado's water plan. This week, we will update Chapter 8, get it in there so people can review it within the context of the plan itself, as this was accepted by the board last Wednesday. So busy week last week. For those of you who read the first draft but have not read the new one, you will notice it's under 6 pages. The subcommittee who debated this prior to bringing it forward to the IBCC wanted to keep it short, still at the principal level. It should be noted that this is a guidance document not just for a potential new Trans Mountain diversion, but also for some interrelated actions that need to happen with or without a new Trans Mountain diversion. Conservation is discussed. It refers to the stretch goal that we just went over a few slides ago. Environmental resiliency is discussed, as is further described in 6.6 that we discussed a few slides ago. And last but not least, with or without a new Trans Mountain diversion, we will need some type of collaborative program, that water bank that we were talking about, to reduce demands. Also, perhaps looking at augmentation, such as cloud seeding, as well as reservoir operations, to ensure that there's not only no compact deficit, but also that other big river issues, such as falling below power pool, does not happen. Next slide. Just like all of these other elements that need to move forward with or without a new TMD, this collaborative program is further discussed. It happens to be discussed in section 9.1, and it says exactly what I just said in terms of needing to prevent a deficit from occurring. And it talks about moving forward with that as a high priority and involving stakeholders. Can we wait until the end to? Oh, okay. Sounds good. Let's go to the next slide. So there's a few other changes in the second draft of Colorado's water plan. So let's go through those. There's many more, but just wanted to highlight a few. Agricultural viability. Sections 6.3.4 and 6.5 talk about agricultural viability as being very important. Agricultural viability was mentioned by members of the Interbasin Compact Committee as a part of the water plan that was missing. In addition, organizations like the Colorado Agricultural Water Alliance and the Association of Vegetable Farmers of Colorado indicated that they wanted to see more actions related to agricultural viability, and we've updated Colorado's water plan to add some of those actions based off of ongoing stakeholder discussions. Next slide. Climate change. Several members of the public asked to have some additional detail on climate change as part of the plan, and so we've added that in Chapter 4. There was already quite a bit in Chapter 5, Section 7.2, 6.5, and 6.6. All discuss regulatory barriers to climate adaptation, the need to plan for climate adaptation, etc. So climate change is further discussed in the plan. The basin implementation plans were updated. back in April. Those have been finalized for now. They're all living documents, but the water plan was updated throughout the water plan to incorporate the updated basin implementation plans. And there's a lot of great in-depth information summarizing those BIPs. Alternative agricultural transfers. This section was also updated, partially based off of public comment, but also based off of recent legislative changes that allow for pilots not just from ag to municipal sharing, but also agriculture to other agricultural uses, agriculture to the environment and industry, etc. So that section has been updated to reflect that, as well as some additional work in the BIPs, etc. So with that, we'll get into education and outreach a little bit more when Kate speaks in a minute, but this was also updated to include planning for how we move forward with water education and outreach. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Becky, who's going to talk about the strategy for updating Colorado's water plan.
Great. Just briefly interjecting here, the current thinking is that CWCB will be responsible for the next version of Colorado's water plan. We expect that will be sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, and that will be determined at, by the CWCB in the future. Is that okay? All right. And in terms of defining success, I think as we move forward into the final phase of the development of Colorado's water plan, we have recognized the high level of engagement that's happened during the plan and the shift towards collaboration within the water community that we feel is reflected in the second draft of the plan. So on that note, we would consider the development process itself as successful. As you can see from these bullets on the slide, that's some of how we measured success. As the implementation phase, though, draws near, it's important that we consider how we continue to ensure success. I think that's where we really will be able to say, was this worth it? There's many components and actions detailed throughout the plan, and using these to measure success will be important in the coming years. It's also important that we continue to measure success across the entire plan as we move forward. So some of the elements that can be success that can be gauged now in the future will be determined in the future or some point over time. Some of what you see here is how we're taking an introductory look at measuring success in the future. Keep going. And I'm now going to pass it over to Kate. Many of you know who she is because she's done so much good work on the outreach and education piece of the plan. So she's been out and about and gotten you materials if you need them. So her big push is to make sure that people stay involved as we move forward. And so I'm going to pass it over to Kate.
Great, thanks, Becky. So you can go ahead and advance the slide. As many of you know, and as Becky said, outreach efforts over the past 2 years really already demonstrate success on the grassroots development process. And we have an action plan in place to make sure that that happens long term. As part of that, we're planning to create a new outreach, education, and public engagement grant fund that will increase the funding available for these projects statewide. Like Jacob talked about, in terms of building public acceptance in order to line up funding, that will require new partnerships and projects, and some of those will hopefully be eligible for funds through this new grant fund. So the public is clearly engaged in the development process. As you can see on the slide, we've received over 24,000 comments to date, and we've responded to all of those, and the second draft reflects significant progress in updating based on that feedback. There were over 150 basin-specific outreach meetings. That's in addition to the regular roundtable meetings that happened during development of the basin implementation plans, and we owe huge gratitude to the hundreds of volunteers and the other folks in the basin who helped get the word out about the basin plans and the water plan, including the public education, participation, and outreach work group, the Basin Roundtable members, the stakeholder groups, the Water Resources Review Committee, and of course the Foundation for Water Education. All of these folks helped get the word out and helped on outreach. So many of you over the past 10 years have attended over 1,000 regular roundtable meetings, which to me is quite amazing. We've seen huge interest on our website. We've had nearly, probably over now, 15,000 unique hits on our website. The second round of the Water Resources Review Committee hearings just kicked off, and we'll be getting those comments through our website this time. We'll take verbal public comments one more time at our CWCB board meeting in September, and you can review all of those comments, including all of the comments we've received over the past 2 years online. But the key here is that there's still time, so we encourage all of you who have input, hopefully on some of what you've heard today, even if we don't get to your questions, to submit those comments online. The message here is the earlier the better. The sooner you get your comments in, the sooner we can really start thinking about how we might work those into the final draft. And really, not only that, it's really important to engage directly with the Basin Roundtables as they are already moving forward with implementation of the Basin implementation plans. We'll have analysis at our CWCB meetings this fall regarding all of the comments we received through the September deadline, and a report on how those comments really help shape the final draft. We're looking for photos from around the state related to water, agriculture, and all the values in the plan, so please send those in to cowaterplan@state.co.us, and of course we'll acknowledge you in the final water plan. And finally, we do also really want to thank Kristin Maharg and the Colorado Foundation for Water Education for hosting this webinar and giving us just another opportunity to get the word out about the plan.
Wonderful. Thank you, Becky, Jacob, and Kate. That was a lot of information over a very short period of time, and so I'd like to open it back up for questions now. We had several questions coming in over the past hour, so we'll take a look at those first. But if you do have a question, as a reminder, your audio is disabled, so we ask you to type your questions in the question box and submit those here to the presenters so that we can review them and get them on our radar. So looking at questions from Jacob's presentation, lots of interest on the funding piece here, Jacob. There was some comments about maybe a water use or infrastructure fee for state-sponsored water projects. Is that a popular issue or not so much?
I don't know that it's a popular issue. I wouldn't say that it sounds a little bit like the water user fee that we discussed, which is a local option or a fee associated with sort of every fixture, appliance, equipment, etc., that you would buy. So that was discussed a little bit. And if you have great ideas, let us know. We'll be happy to consider them.
And looks like this question was similar in nature. Let's see. What about all the federal programs and funding that are already available? How do they fit into that chapter?
Great question. So that section does discuss available federal funding sources. However, I will just say the age of having federal funded projects, it appears to be over. So while we need to interface and leverage federal funding sources available, several of which are listed in that section, large federal dollars available on a sufficient and ongoing enough level are just not going to be there. We as a state need to move forward and find solutions.
Great, and then there was here just a clarifying question about what exactly is a lien event?
What does lean stand for exactly?
It doesn't. It's not an acronym.
Oh, good. Okay, great. So basically, it came out of a process out of Toyota where they looked at ways to get efficiencies out of their processes, both on the mechanical side and on their administrative side. So, and the Denver Water has been a big proponent of lean, and they've actually implemented it across their agency, looking at things from like organization of trucks and consistency there to big taxi paper processes and how to make those more efficient. So the state has started really looking at lean and implementing some lean processes across the state and saying, okay, how can we be better at this? And so the permitting has come up as, and the permitting process has come up as an idea that would be fit for lean. Without our extensive knowledge of lean, we thought, oh, this would be one process. As we've done some research and have talked to folks that you'd really have to break up the pieces of permitting and do a lean or a series of lean events on specific pieces of it. So where we look at efficiencies and redundancies and where we can be more efficient. Or duplicative efforts also.
Okay, thank you. Another question here on what is the significance of state endorsement in the permitting process, Becky?
So that's a tough and sensitive issue, Anne. Or sorry, as we all know. And so I think it's important to recognize where that came from, and that there was some issues in previous decades of projects projects that went through a lot of the project permitting process and then didn't go through. And so a lot of dollars were spent there and without any additional firm yield or supply to a specific area. So one of the highlights that came out of that was that, or highlights or lowlights, was it was considered that the state's lack of support or involvement may have been a piece of how projects died in the federal realm. So it didn't say if you got state endorsement that you should automatically get a federal permit. However, the state needs to look at some of their issues earlier on in the process and determine what criteria needed to be met for a certain project to be okay in terms of water quality, fish and wildlife mitigation, and any other natural resources issues, concerns. So a state endorsement would help in terms of funding or work with federal agencies and things like that.
Okay, thanks for the explanation there, Becky. Moving on, we have a question about a possible tax credit for homeowners who install Xeric landscaping or efficient products. Has this been officially proposed at the state level, and is there a similar option for agriculture?
So this is one of those actions that has the word explore in front of it. So it's an opportunity to explore whether or not it would make sense. Kevin Reedy, who's the lead on conservation, municipal conservation for the agency, and I did a little bit of math, and it actually costs quite a bit of money to replace turf per acre foot of savings. However, looking at that, we thought maybe a small incentive could be something worth exploring. So that's why it says explore. If anybody has any ideas about that, we'd be open to it. But it turned up to be about $10,000 an acre foot. In terms of agriculture, no, that hasn't been proposed. If you have some good ideas, let us know.
All right, thank you. Moving on here, the concept of environmental resilience in terms of creating a baseline and tracking those benchmarks. At what point will this be assessed?
That's a great question. And I wouldn't say that we have all the answers right now. There's two main components to this. The first is in the statewide water supply initiative, continuing to do better work establishing from a sort of statewide perspective where we're at in terms of environmental resilience and the like. The second component is supporting these stream management plans. And so in these areas that are important from an environmental and or recreational perspective, supporting those will be important to establish baselines. Perhaps the third component is that if there's a consumptive use project, or even, for that matter, an environmental or recreational project going into an area, ensuring that there's monitoring to understand the current conditions before that project is implemented and then ongoing afterward will be important, and the state does support a monitoring program.
Okay, thank you. Kate, we have a question for you here. What kinds of education and outreach programs have been made for K through 12 audiences, so youth programs?
Great, thanks. I'm assuming this is on the water plan. And so over the past few years, we've done a few things with K-12 audiences. We have a staff member, his name is Ben Wade, and he's great. He gets out all around the state, primarily to educate students about conservation, but given the water plan effort, he's also educating K through 12 students on the water plan and topics within the water plan and how conservation is related. We also, way back in September 2014, at one of our first meetings where we gave an outreach presentation about the water plan, had a group of students through the Watershed Education Project and at the Telluride High School visit our CWCB board meeting and present on topics related to water. At our most recent, actually just last week, meeting, we talked about a group of Dolores High School students that all wrote, there were 26 typed letters we received that covered a variety of issues, and it was amazing how different each letter was. But their class was really kind of diving into the water plan and the issues it would present in their communities. The Basin Roundtables, some of them have included K-12 education in their education action plans through the Public Education Participation and Outreach Work Group that I mentioned earlier. And moving forward, we're really excited to assess the needs in terms of K-12 education through the recommendations that we have in Section 9.5 on education and figure out where the gaps are and how we partner together to advance education for K-12 moving forward. Thanks for that question.
Yeah. Another question here for Jacob. What is the current plan for monitoring and measuring that conservation stretch goal?
That's a great question again. So some of you are familiar with House Bill 1051. However, using the number isn't very helpful. What that does is it asks water providers to provide data annually to CWCB about water use and other aspects of their system. So through that, combined with the updates to the statewide water supply initiative, where we'll ask more than just the quote covered entities, which we discussed further, but also those small water providers to assess where we are at and on an ongoing basis. In terms of the baseline is SWASI 2010, which is essentially a 2008 number. So that's what we're looking at.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. Are there any other questions here?
I think we can take this one. It's somewhat vague, but go ahead.
Yeah. So, question about environmental projects that are considered for funding under the water plan. How does the state envision its role for proposals that involve water quality issues? So treating wastewater for potable reuse, water quality standards with potential drinking water sources. Becky, can you field that question?
Yeah, definitely. So as you read through the water plan, you'll notice that there is some emphasis on water quality throughout the plan. Maybe not as much as some would have liked, but the integration of water quality and quantity was specifically called out in the executive order to address. And so there's been an initial process where we've really started working within our state agency realm, and the CDPHE and CWCB have been working closely together through this, and we've highlighted some areas to work on as it relates to water quality. One of them is that our loan program currently doesn't allow for water reuse projects, and so could we expand our loan program to include that as a water supply is one of the areas. And so we're looking at water quality issues. Also, the WSRA program is open to looking at projects always that relate to quality issues. There's no constraint there. And then, as always, we're also urging multi-purpose type projects. So if there was an agriculture and an M&I project and an environmental project that proved some water quality benefit, that there's additional funding sources just because of the multi-purpose piece of the project.
Okay, thank you. And I think your response, Becky, answered a couple of other questions we had in terms of incentivizing water efficiency practices and programs. There was another question on monitoring and management using data to maximize efficiency and reduce duplication.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting question. I wouldn't say that the water plan explicitly talks about bringing multiple data sources together in terms of a data management system. It does discuss the need to continue to do the Colorado Decision Support Systems, expand that to the South Platte, which should be forthcoming within the next year or two, as well as into the Arkansas, and that's an integrated data management system. And then it does talk about the Basin Needs Decision Support System, which looks at tracking projects and methods throughout the state. And there's also a database on environmental and recreational projects and methods, and of course the water use database from 1051, as we mentioned earlier. So I think that that's an interesting question, and if you have great ideas, let us know.
Great. Well, that concludes the webinar for today. I just want to thank all the folks that asked us those great questions, both ahead of time in the questionnaire as well as during the webinar. We really appreciate all the attentiveness and thought and dedication that you've put into this process, which is a really important dialogue and process for the future of our state. So we want to thank the staff at the Colorado Water Conservation Board, as well as all the Basin Roundtable members and the IBCC across the state for the countless hours and effort they have put in. And the work is just starting, so we look forward to the next couple of months of receiving public input on the second draft of the plan. And then at that point, the plan will be finalized and submitted to the governor in December, and that's when the work begins, right? Implementation of many of these prioritized actions and recommendations. And so please stay involved. We will send you just a follow-up thank you email with a link to the recording of this webinar today, as well as a quick questionnaire to let us know if it was an effective use of your time and if it met your expectations. So thank you everyone so much, and we look forward to speaking with you soon. Take care. Have a great day.